Okay, can I get started? It's okay? Cool, awesome. Uh, thanks for coming to my little session here. My name is Martin. I work for Broadcom, or more specifically for the Spring engineering team. So that's the team doing Spring Boot and Spring Framework and all those kind of things. And my special focus is on the tools. So my team and I myself, we do the tooling support for people hacking on Spring applications in their IDE of their choice. Of course, if you are at this conference, you might be using Eclipse, maybe. Maybe you might be using other IDEs, but we will take a look at that. So I work here from Hamburg in Germany. So in case you want to talk to me in German, that's possible as well after the talk. And I will do a lot of demos. I hope that's fine with you. And if you want to raise any questions, have any questions, I'm not sure what the official procedure is. So I would be able to take questions in between, anytime basically. We can also kind of defer that to the end, whatever works, right? Okay, cool. So if you hack on Spring applications, and I see a few folks doing that in the room, that's awesome. And you use the IDE of your choice. So my goal is not to convince you of a specific IDE, right? So I'm not here to tell you you have to use Eclipse, or you have to use VS Code, or you have to use IntelliJ, or whatever. Use the IDE that you prefer, that you like, that you love, that your company tells you you have to use, whatever, and just continue to use that. My goal is to make you productive in the tool, in the IDE that you have chosen, that you're given. If I take a look at the landscape, what I usually see is kind of people use Eclipse, people use VS Code, people maybe use Thea, or use things like cloud-based IDEs based on Thea or based on VS Code, like code spaces and things like that. And for all those environments, my team is actually, we try to make you more productive doing Spring in those environments. So we do the extensions for Eclipse, we do the extensions for VS Code, and you can use them in all those environments. So those are the bits and pieces that I work on. If you prefer IntelliJ, there is the Ultimate Edition that already comes with a lot of Spring-based tooling from JetBrains itself. So that's awesome, right? That's good news for me. I don't have to do a lot of stuff in that area. They do all the work for me. So that's awesome, right? They make you productive as a Spring developer in IntelliJ already. So that's awesome. That is why I, in my demos, of course, because I love the stuff that I'm doing so much, use VS Code or Eclipse for demos. But you will see basically kind of similar stuff in IntelliJ as well. So don't be afraid. And with that, I really would like to kind of show you a little bit of, and the talk is called Spring Tools Live as a first part. So I will do a lot of live coding. And the second part is all the great new things. So I will talk a lot about what we did and all the new stuff that I'm especially passionate about and that I really like, right? So good stuff. So let's jump onto live demos. And for these live demos, I will use VS Code today. But as I said, you will basically see the same stuff in Eclipse as well if you use the Spring tools for Eclipse distribution or the Eclipse distribution with Spring tools installed on top of that. It's more or less kind of the same. It looks a little bit different, but the underlying things are pretty much the same. The stuff that we focus on for the tools is nowadays, in the old days we have 3 areas. Now there are 4 areas. Right? The 4 areas are, we would like to make it easy to get started, right? Create new projects and get started with a new Spring Boot application in your IDE. That's why usually you would go to start.spring.io and create your new project, or you have your custom version in-house for that. You create new projects, you import it into the IDE. There are wizards in the IDEs that basically give you the same experience. You can say, Spring Initializer, create new Maven project, or create new Gradle project, and you can go from there, create a new project, that's it, right? That's not really new, existing there. That's one thing that we do, make it easy to get started, right? You can even customize your own initializer project back then if you have that in your company running, right? Your own custom version of that. You can also integrate that over here, use that in the background to create new projects in the IDE for you. That's also possible, right? That's the first thing. The second piece is we try to make it easy to navigate and use and work with existing Spring code in your IDE. right? That's the second part of the equation, and that's probably the area where you spend most of your time hacking on code, right? So we would like to make it as easy as possible and as fast and as efficient as possible for you to work on your source code in your IDE when you hack on Spring applications, and therefore we have a bunch of features implemented. The third area is we would like to give you more information about Spring apps that are running. So how does the running Spring Boot app behave compared to what you have in your workspace? We will take a look at that soon. And the fourth area, and that's kind of the new kid on the block here, is we would like to try to make it easy for you to stay up to date, right? There are new Spring Boot versions coming out all the time. More like every week there's a new CVE patch version coming out. Every other week there's a new Spring Boot minor version coming out. Whatever, right? New Spring Boot versions and new versions of dependent libraries as well coming out all the time. And sometimes they're even major version jumps or minor version jumps with changes, deprecations, whatever. So a lot of change is going on. So we would like to make it easy for you to always stay up to date, right? To always be up to date on the latest and greatest version all the time in your IDE. Right? Those are the four areas, and I will walk through basically the three. I will skip the getting started because that's boring, right? We all know how to do that. That's all there, right? So work with existing code, and work with the existing code. In the early days, in the early versions of the Spring tools, we focused a lot on make it easy to understand the code, to understand the concepts of the code. Because if you hack Spring Boot applications, you usually do not necessarily only think about classes and interfaces and methods and things like that. You think about concepts like a controller, a service, a repository, a domain object, and things like that. So you slightly think about these higher level concepts that Spring introduces or gives you to kind of structure your application. So if you think about that, we give you these kind of go-to symbols in Workspace, where you can see all the symbols in your workspace from a Springy perspective. If you type add, for example, @/, you see all your request mappings, @+, you see all the beans that you have defined in your source code, and you can super easily understand how all these things behave, right? If you say controller, you see, oh, those are probably all my controllers. And that's a pretty smart mechanism because it understands the Spring concepts and the Spring annotations behind the scenes and how they are kind of connected to each other. So this kind of gives you a lot of stuff, and that's already there for quite a long time. And the good thing is it's super fast, right? And gives you super fast navigation to all your stuff in your source code. So you can use that in Eclipse as well. Really cool. So that's kind of the first part of these working with source code, and the second part that we dive into more recently is we were brave enough to think about these kind of giving you validations and errors and hints how to change your code, make changes to your code easier from a Springy perspective. So for example, we started to implement these validations and errors like custom things. Like in this case, you have the auto-white annotation on a field, and if you listen carefully to Josh Long, for example, or Oliver Drotbom or whatever, you know that this is field injection. This is possible but evil. So you should not use that, right? So don't use field injection. You should use constructor injection instead. So of course, there is now a quick fix in place to change this to constructor injection, right? So, and you can do that across your whole project. Easy. Get this thing, get your error warning or whatever, and get a quick fix in place. And that's what we try to do basically throughout all the different Spring patterns that we see. And we started with that, and we will continue with that with all the other Spring patterns as well, right? So for example, if you take a look at here, you see, oh, there's an auto-wired constructor. In Spring, you don't need to have the auto-white annotation on there, so there is a quick fix to just remove that, for example. But let's go back to this, right? There is another thing that gets highlighted here. It's kind of the path variable, and the path variable say, oh, it's name owner ID, but the parameter is also called owner ID, so you don't need that. That's why it tells you you don't need to do that, so you can remove that. And it gives you the option to not only remove it in this location, to also kind of in this file, for example. So let me just fix this across the whole file. So this is basically remove throughout the whole file, this Spring specific things, if this matches. Right? Good news, by the way, if you sometimes don't like the decisions that we make for, oh, you should not really use this, or you should not really do that. And there's, of course, a preference in place where you can switch and change the severity of every single validation that we do in every single quick fix to your needs, right? So if you really like field injection, you can disable this check and it will not appear. Otherwise, you will probably, if you really like that, you'll probably see a lot of warnings and stuff like that. There's another thing over here. It says, oh, there's a kind of request mapping being used. And there are more specific annotations being defined in Spring nowadays. So in this case, there is kind of, it's for HTTP GET, for HTTP POST. You should really use the more specific ones. So there is, of course, also kind of a little hint and a quick fix in place saying you should replace this with the corresponding more specific annotations. In this case, it would tell you, oh, replace this with GET because it knows you said it's HTTP GET, basically. You can also do that throughout the file, and it replaces basically all the stuff throughout the file with the corresponding more specific annotations. So that's cool. Awesome. Let's take a look at the some other things that I've been working on quite a bit these days. Is we want to give you more quick access to all your beans if you use them, and all the other things, and if you use them in your code. For example, you type a conditional on bean and you say name, you get content assist for all the bean names, right? So you can say, oh, it's kind of, I have a property-based welcome message provider bean somewhere, do it, right? So you can just do content assist for that. And it's not only content assist because we understand all the stuff, we can also do a quick navigation to that, right? So you can just say go to definition and it jumps to that bean definition, for example, as well. And we try to do this not only for conditional on bean, but basically we try to do this for all the Spring annotations, all the basic ones that are out there, and as many as we can do. As much as we can do for those annotations, support the specific things that are maybe custom to bean names, bean annotations, and things like that. In case you're missing something, in case you really love a specific Spring annotation, there's no support built in, and you're missing that because you have to copy paste it all the time, because you have to find it yourself all the time, please let us know, right? File an issue, because we would be really happy to hear from you about those specific things, specific annotations that you use a lot, that there's missing support for that. Then we can prioritize that and work on that as well, right? With that, I would like to jump to the reminder class, one of my favorite classes in this little sample project, because it's not really useful, but it can demo so much great stuff. For example, it's using a spell expression over here. Not sure if you know spell. Some people use spell, some people don't. Spell Spring expression language, some kind of expression, quite rich expression language. Sometimes I don't even understand all the stuff in there. So I learned spell while doing the tooling for it. That's quite interesting. But spell, yeah, it looks okayish, but we now do syntax highlighting for all the embedded languages in Spring. So embedded languages is kind of specific languages that you use inside of Spring annotations. For example, spell expressions. They're now syntax highlighted. And if the syntax is broken, you will get warnings and errors about syntax is broken, right? And the syntax highlighting will go away and things like that. So it's syntax highlighting and validation whether this is syntactically correct spell expression. And you get navigation for certain things. So in this case, you refer to a bean called welcome message provider. So you get navigation to this bean from inside of the spell expression. If there's a method being referenced, you can jump to the method directly of that bean. Things like that, so we try to understand that. In this case, there's a typing reference, Spring Boot version, that's coming from the Spring library, so you can jump to that type as well and navigate directly. So you can easily deal with those spell expressions, or a lot easier than before, right? Gives you a lot more things that you usually like to use in Java code anyway. You go do this all the time, right? You go to the type and you look at the methods and stuff like that. So we started for the spell expressions with that giving you syntax highlighting, giving you navigation. Of course, as a sneak preview, one of the next things would be auto-completion, of course, for things like that. Right? Makes sense. And as I said, spell is quite a heavy kind of, or a rich language, not a heavy language, a rich language. Sometimes spell expressions are being used and I don't understand them. So we started to integrate, of course everybody needs to be in this AI space nowadays, right? So we said, oh, we can do that as well. So we have, if you running in VS Code, for example, and you have GitHub Copilot installed and you have a subscription to that and you use Copilot in case, as kind of a first step in this area, there's now a little thing that you can say, explain me the spell expression. What is this spell expression actually doing? And it asks Copilot as kind of a quick shortcut, Copilot chat to say, please explain me the spell expression, and we craft the corresponding prompt around that so that it gives you a nice summary and a nice explanation what this spell expression is all about. And if the spell expression contains method, it kind of feeds the meaning of the method or the body of the method to Copilot as well, so that Copilot knows a little bit more about how to reason about this spell expression and how to make sense about that. So that's one of these embedded languages that we try, and we will see a few more. The other thing, of course, not sure if you use the value annotation. I love that. So we basically know that if you use the value annotation in Spring, you usually refer to resources on the class path. So we give you contences for the class path. You can refer to properties, so we give you contences for properties. And if you do, let's go back to let's say the class path version. There's also navigation again in place, right? So it can directly jump to and open the file that refer from this class path value of the value annotation. So with that, I would like to add a profile annotation over here. And the profile annotation, we also know about all the profiles that you use in your project. The profiles that you have defined somewhere else, right? There are no really predefined projects, with a few exceptions, predefined profiles. But if you have used profiles in your project, we know that, and we can give you contenances for that. So it gives you contenances for these profiles. And in this case, it, I think, even tells you where is this profile, this exact profile, being used throughout your code. So we can see that, oh, this profile is also being used for this bean declaration and this profile annotation, because we know, oh, it refers to the same profile. So you can see easily where is your profile being used throughout your project, right? Find all the references to this specific profile. So with that, I also love to take a look at repositories, because people use repositories because people store data and things like that. So there is the owner repository, for example, and as you can see, there's a query thing, and there's again the explain this query with Copilot. It's a little bit easy for us because Copilot is doing all the work to explain the SQL or HQL or whatever query, but we again know that, oh, this project uses Hibernate or whatever, so it's an HQL query, and we can tell Copilot, oh, please explain this HQL query for me. But there's also, of course, nowadays, syntax highlighting for that. So you get syntax highlighting for these queries, for the query annotations, for HQL, JPQL, just SQL, things like that. And following this pattern that you might have seen already, these kind of, doing validations, doing syntax highlighting. We also do validations, so if the query is broken, it's broken syntax, we show that. And we also kind of try to give you a little bit more information about, for example, there is kind of a parameter that you use over here. So if you click on that, you'll see that these method parameters being highlighted. And this is not by accident, this is because we know that there's a parameter in your query that fits to a specific method parameter in Spring. So we can basically highlight that and say this is the same, or give you the link to jump basically to that definition of this query parameter that you have. So it's following kind of the same pattern that we do. Validations, providing you quick fixes, giving you navigation for all these Spring-specific elements that we have. So really, really, really like that. In my demo project, there's a little weird thing, because if I start it up, I can see that. Let's see if it still starts up with all my hacky changes here. Yes, it does. And there is a Spring Boot dashboard that shows you all the kind of the running Spring app. So you can see Spring Boot, Spring Pet Clinic is running. You can even start and stop it from here. You can open up a little browser saying, oh, go to the home page basically of this. If it uses 8080, then it jumps to localhost 8080. If you have specified a different port, it jumps to that. So you don't need to go to your browser and say localhost : and then, what was the port exactly? 8080, 8080, whatever. You can see all the beans that are running in your live application, right? So if I kind of stop this again, you'll see here all the beans in your app, right? You can jump to the beans. You can jump to your request mappings. That's basically the same as with the symbols coming from your source code. But if I start up the application, it switches over and shows you the beans that are active and the request mappings that are active in the running application. So it actually looks at the running Spring Boot app and say, okay, what are the beans that are really active in the running application? What are the request mappings that are really available? And if I say, for example, for owners, I can directly jump to the owners thing and stuff like that. And this information is not only visible in this little tree view, because what you usually try to do if you run your Spring app, or what you know, is that Spring creates all those beans, it wires all those beans together for you, it injects all those beans, and maybe does a bit of magic here and there as well. But if something goes wrong or something does not work, you need to kind of think about it, basically try to find it out yourself, right? You need to think about, oh, in my source code, it tells me I have my owner controller that should have a repository injected. But what happens at runtime? Where is this repository coming from? I don't know, because Spring is doing all of that for me. Here, we now map this information onto your source code. So the live information from the running Spring Boot app about which beans are created, how are the beans wired, we map this information back onto your source code. So in this case, you see this green highlight tells you this component is active. It exists in the running application. And in here, you see there's an owner repository being injected into this bean. And you can even see, if I hover over this, where this repository bean is coming from. So it is this repository bean that is being injected. So you see these injections. And in here, in the owner repository, you can even see this repository is being injected into. These are all the bits and pieces in my source code where this bean is being injected into. And something else is being injected into this repository. And where does it come from? And this is not information that we guess from the source code or that we try to find out from the source code. It's the information coming from the running Spring Boot application, really, which I think is really interesting, because if I take a look at, for example, let's say the welcome controller over here, we see that there is an auto-wired annotation for something like set welcome message provider. And there's a default thing called hello, and this auto-wired thing is not highlighted. So the controller is active, but there's nothing being injected here. So it looks like this auto-wired thing did not happen, right? Weird. Let's see if we can find a welcome message thing. Oh, there's a bean called welcome message provider over here. So this is the bean from my source code, right? We know that, oh, there's a bean being defined in your source code. But the component annotation is not highlighted, so this bean is not active at runtime. This bean does not exist at runtime. And you see that directly in your source code, right? You don't have to think about it or try to find it in the running application somehow or debug it. You can directly see it in your source code. And in this case, it's being annotated with conditional on and with the profile. And for the profile, you see, oh, the profile is being highlighted, so the active profile is demo. So we highlight, oh, the demo profile is active, so that should be fine, right? The conditional property it tells me, did not find property pet clinic as one message. So this property was not found. That is why this condition did not match, and then this bean was not created. So you see this information directly in your source code, which I think is pretty interesting and pretty nice to debug and maybe not even debug, but also kind of learn about what happens at runtime. We try to bridge this gap that you usually this mapping that you try to do in your head about looking at your source code, staring at your source code, seeing all the annotations and all the concepts, and then what happens at runtime. And the cool thing, I cannot really demo this right now, but that's possible. The really cool thing is you can connect your IDE to not only the Spring Boot app that you run from your IDE, you can also configure a Spring Boot app running somewhere else with certain JMX parameters, for example, or HTTP things, so that the IDE can get this information from another Spring Boot application running somewhere else as well. So you can actually display this information for multiple running instances of the Spring Boot app. So for example, if you want to say, oh, I start up my Spring Boot app locally on my machine using the profile 1 and profile B and with profile C, and you have 3 applications running, you can actually see the information from all those 3 applications in the IDE. So you can exactly see this bean is active in profile 1 and 2, but not in profile 3 from these running things. And you can even do that with kind of, if you make this network connection happen, if you run your Spring Boot app in a container, in your testing environment, if you're really brave, you can do that in your production environment as well. Maybe I don't recommend that, but theoretically possible. Wherever you run your Spring Boot app, as long as you can make the network connection, configure the running app in a way that it gives you this information, because the running Spring Boot app has to give you this information to basically deliver it to the IDE, we can visualize that. And you can basically compare those things, see what is being created in my integration environment versus what is being created when I run things locally, because sometimes, I don't know, it uses an environment variable, some different repositories, and different database connections, whatever, in the different environments, and you can see that directly in your source code, basically, where everything is coming from, which I think is pretty nice. Okay, so let me stop this running application. I already mentioned that there's a situation that new Spring Boot applications, Spring Boot versions coming out all the time. Spring Boot applications, of course, as well, but new Spring Boot versions. So we thought about we should do something about it, right? We should do something. And the first step is that we do is actually tell you about this, right? So we basically show you directly in the IDE that there is a new Spring Boot version available compared to what you have in your project, and which version is that. And we do this for new patch versions, so you can see, oh, there's a new patch version available, or there's a new minor version, or there's a new major version. And we also give you an idea about the support ranges that are around. So the open source version of Spring and Spring Boot has a kind of certain support range. Every version has a certain support range in the open source, and then you can buy commercial support, then you get longer support, right? And that has a kind of a certain support range as well. And we visualize this information in the IDE. So you get, for example, in this case, you get an idea about, you use 2.7.18 in this case, in my poor little old project, and this has ended open source support already, almost a year. And if you want to get commercial support until whatever, then you have to kind of buy commercial support for this, right? Or there is still existing open source support for this until then. You can basically see this information. And you can see whether there's a new version available or not. Right? In this case, there is no new patch version for 2.7 available, but there's a new major version available, 3.3.4. Right? By the way, depending on what you prefer, what you like, right? You really like to bother yourself and all your developers with every new patch version that show up as an error in your project, right? To really see that immediately the day it comes out, you can configure that, right? If you think Yeah, an error for patch version, that's awesome, but please don't tell me an error if there's a new major version coming out, because I will probably not jump to that the next day. You can configure that severity independently. So you can configure severities for patch, minor, major versions, and you can configure severity for these open source and commercial supports, right? So if you are on a commercial support plan, you're probably not interested in the open source support ranges and vice versa, so you can configure that to your needs and whatever environment you are in, right? Okay, so that's kind of giving you information, right? Step one, giving you information about what is around, what's new, so that you can always stay up to date, right? And usually it should be pretty easy to stay up to date with the latest patch version. It's usually just switching the version, right? And there's kind of a little, if I would kind of change this over, there's kind of a little quick fix, of course, showing up saying, yeah, I incremented the patch version here. Jump to that, right? But that's the easy thing, right? Everybody can do that manually. We can also automate that with a quick fix. That's great. Go to a new patch version. Awesome. But the real interesting thing is, what if there's a new minor version coming out? Or what is if there's a new major version coming out, right? And there are new major versions coming out every now and then, and sometimes they are kind of easy to adopt, sometimes they're more complicated to adopt. The latest major version jump for Spring Boot, that was kind of from 2.7 to 3, that was quite a big jump, because you had kind of increment your Java runtime to 17. You have to switch to the Jakarta packages from JavaX packages and things like that. A lot of changes. And of course, the Spring Boot team is also kind of quite active in changing property keys here and there every once in a while and doing things like that. And it's really kind of cumbersome sometimes to kind of adopt all those changes. There's a nice README, so there's a great migration guide from the Spring Boot team. They tell you everything, right? There's nothing being hidden. So you can walk through this guide all the time and kind of adopt every bit and piece. But we tried to codify this guide with the help of the open source project called OpenRewrite. Chatted about that last time here at EclipseCon. So there's kind of basically support, a quick fix for this, right? So if there's a new major version, new minor version, you can execute a quick fix, and this quick fix basically tries to where's this preview? Clicked on the wrong thing. So there it is. Okay. So it basically tries to make as many changes as possible in an automated way for you. There's no guarantee that everything is being changed automatically. There are probably still bits and pieces that you need to do yourself, but it tries to do the most annoying things for you. So for example, if I take a look at the POM file here, right, it updates the Maven compiler versions to Java 17, a few dependencies, switches to a new MySQL connector, the Jakarta XML bind thing, and stuff like that. So it really does quite a bit of changes to your POM file. And if I go down, of course, for kind of, I don't know, base entity, it switches over the JavaX to Jakarta packages, does that as well for other things, and it also does some kind of cleanup for you, right? So if you would not have executed my little awesome quick fix to remove the path variable, for example, the thing that you don't need, or the unnecessary all-white annotations, you can do these kind of cleanup along the way as well, because behind the scenes, it is all these quick fixes also use OpenRewrite recipes to basically clean up the code and make the code changes to the ASTs on the code. So this kind of tries to make it easy for you to jump to new versions, and you can get rid of the most annoying tasks, right? Again, it's not a guarantee that it does everything for you, but as you can see here, for the pet controller, for example, let me jump to that. It switches over to the Jakarta ones. It removes these unnecessary parameter over here. Yeah, that's probably it for this case. Yeah. So quite a bunch of changes that it does throughout your code to really make it easy for you to stay up to date. That's kind of the fourth area that's relatively new to us. So we do this for quite some time already, and there's we try to make this for every new Spring Boot version coming out, right? So whenever there's a new Spring Boot version coming out, there's kind of an update for the tooling as well to allow you to jump to this new Spring Boot version too, so that it's as easy as possible. If you're missing anything, right, that's kind of my usual ask for feedback. So if you're missing anything, if there's anything that is, I don't know, slow, or slow is of course not possible anymore because everything is so fast. Um, if something is slow, something is not working, something is missing, you're missing a quick fix, you're missing in the migration something, tell us. Right? We are always looking for feedback. And with that, that's kind of my little run through all these demos and stuff like that we've been working on, just to highlight the things that I'm most passionate about. So that's the luxury that I have. I can talk about the stuff that I'm most passionate about. If you want to know more, file issues, whatever, those are the links. And with that, I'm of course happy to answer questions if there are any questions. I haven't seen anything in between, but if there are questions now, happy to answer questions. And if there are no questions, happy to answer additional questions throughout the whole conference until Thursday afternoon, probably. So, but I've seen 2 hands, right, from Jonah and Tobias. Yeah.
Looks great, thank you. When you referenced the Beanstalk, showed the references,
Yes.
have you tested that with a large code base, like you get 100 or 200 stuff and perhaps can search in that list, or is that kind of feedback you would need?
So we have large code bases. So we test those. I take this as kind of a performance question about large code bases, more or less, for the beans, for example, or for the information that we have behind the scenes. And I have a little test project that I try to use, which is kind of about 60,000 controller classes, something like that, right? Auto-generated. Don't tell anyone. And all the auto completions, all the quick fixes, and all the navigation that's still instant, right? Even across that code base. Because the indexing, we do some kind of indexing behind the scenes, and this indexing is optimized and cached for all those bits and pieces, so it re-indexes stuff only if you change a file, so it's kind of indexed per file, stuff like that. And it's cached, and it's based on the JDT core parser. So basically, when you create this, when you import this project for the very first time, it indexes and parses all the source code. But even for 60,000 Java files, it's still super fast, right? So it probably takes a few seconds, more or less, or probably less than a minute. And then you have the index data around, and we don't store a lot of index data, right? It's just basically a few core elements of this Spring model that we have behind the scenes, like where are the annotations, where is the Spring being defined, what is the Spring being referring to, and this index can be kept in memory all the time, so we don't need to store this index. We store the index for caching for the next time, but you don't need to kind of read this index if you ask for code completion or if you ask for references. That's still pretty instant. So that works across large code bases as well. If you find a special case where it does not work, let us know. So we'll be more than happy to optimize that as well. But we did a lot of work for the optimization for this because we had this validation in place in the early days, and that was relatively slow and memory consuming. So we completely rewritten that to a whole different validation engine to show up all these warnings and errors and whatever, more or less instantly. And we cache all this information as well. And in the, I don't know, half a year ago or something like that, we changed it because we found out that, oh, if you run these 60,000 files, it kind of runs out of memory. So what's going on there? And back then it was able to deal with projects about 5,000 files, 5,000 Java source code files. And then we changed it basically and we optimized it. So now it can deal with up to 60,000, 70,000 Java files of source code. And then it slowly runs out of memory. If you have larger projects than 60,000 Java source code files, there's basically an option where you can increase the heap space for the Spring tooling. Then you can probably go to 100,000 Java source code files or something like that. So it's not, it takes a little longer, but it's possible. Yeah. We did a lot of work on that. Cool, thanks for the question. So awesome to reveal all that. What's another one?
So I had a question about how the open rewrite is maintained. So if a developer introduces a breaking change, like they change the name of a property, do they also provide the open rewrite for that, or is it an entirely separate team?
Oh yeah, that's a really challenging area. So the question is, who is basically implementing all these OpenRewrite recipes? And that's kind of a big chunk of that is being done in the open source by the team behind OpenRewrite itself. It's kind of a company called Modern. They use the OpenRewrite open source stuff and the recipes for their commercial offering. They have a commercial offering to do things like this, but for all kinds of applications. So they do a lot of this work in the open source. And then we, from the Spring Tools team, we add work to that as well. Most of the open source projects, they don't. So that's why we basically try to assemble the stuff. But most of the stuff is being done by the Modern company, by the team behind OpenRewrite. And we kind of fill the gaps wherever we find them and try to provide more sophisticated recipes or things like that. There's even a kind of a commercial offering. So if you're a commercial Spring customer, there's even a kind of a commercial called Spring App Advisor product that you can buy if you want to, that can do even more for you, but that's more suited for kind of companies running thousands of Spring Boot applications and trying to keep them up to date all the time, things like that. But that's nothing that kind of every open source project that we use or that is on the clusters or whatever is doing on their own. It's usually done by, most of that is done by the Modern team and by other teams like us filling the gaps or contributing things, I think. I think, at least for this space. I'm not sure about the other recipes because there are tons of recipes for other frameworks, of course, and tons of recipes for other languages, and I don't know a lot about that. Just know more about the Java and Spring space, of course. But the writing recipes is actually pretty easy. You can do that yourself if you want to. So it's, you can write them in code, that's one thing, but you can also kind of declare them with YAML. Of course, everything can be written in YAML these days. So you can declare recipes in YAML. So there are building blocks that are implemented, like change a property key in a properties file. And then you can specify in YAML which property key should be migrated to which other property key pretty easily. So if you want to configure those things for your own custom in-house library, for example, because you're using something like that in your company and someone else is using the library that you've built, you can do that pretty easily yourself. Cool. Another question? No? Okay, cool. Thanks for coming and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.